Welcome to Adopting Zero Trust, an independent podcast that dives into the world of zero trust and tells the story of people who are adopting it. Throughout our series, we'll investigate why zero trust is becoming a critical concept for cybersecurity. Our hosts, Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis, will have transparent and open conversations with the people driving modern security approaches forward, while leaving vendor hype behind. It's time to remove implicit trust and buzzwords and get to the root of the movement.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Adopting Zero Trust, or AZT. Today, we're going to be covering an area which I don't believe we've actually covered in any aspect. I think we've talked to someone in the biz dev side that sort of has similar vein, but MSPs or MSSPs, managed security or managed security services providers, however you want to position it, they have probably the most visibility into any other organization in our space, because they are frankly chatting with organizations of all different sizes and many different pain points. So today, fortunately, we have someone who leads up the security efforts for one of such said organizations. JR, I'm going to hand that off to you to give a proper introduction, and then we'll kind of just jump into it.
Well, thanks, Elliot. Thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it. Happy to be here. It's such an important topic. And by the way, confusing topic. So I'm glad that AZT is here to, advocate for some of the principles in being successful at this. As you mentioned, I'm JR Cunningham. I'm the Chief Security Officer at Nuspire. We are a managed security services provider. That's all we do. So we don't do a lot of the other IT stuff like keyboards and mice. We focus specifically on security. We serve some of the largest customers, largest industries on earth, and we serve a wide variety of industries. Our kind of specialty in our background is really the automotive industry and the supply chain around the automotive industry. So we got our start about 23 years ago as an MSSP specifically focused on that industry. Now we do a lot in aerospace, retail, finance sectors. So we do see a lot of different stuff from a lot of different industries. I'm also responsible for our consulting and our strategy programs at Nuspire. So, my team does a lot of the legwork on working with customers to figure out what kind of problems are they trying to solve and how can we help, and what are the things that are concerning to them. So, really happy to share whatever I can, and obviously, you have a lot of listeners that are going to be interested in the topic at large. So hopefully I can contribute.
Oh, I'm certain of that. And I think there's a couple of different things here that I'd love to chat about. So hopefully I don't go too around the rabbit hole. But with your, I guess, bread and butter being in the auto industry, I love just some visibility. And I know this is kind of a sidetrack, and then we'll kind of go into the regular AZT kind of questions. But, with cars essentially becoming software today, how do you see that impacting organizations and their brands from a security perspective? Because obviously they're going to be more connected. If they're doing autopilot or self-driving and some of these other aspects, security is going to be absolutely critical compared to computer systems of today. What kind of visibility do you have into, what your customers are looking at?
We are living in the most profound change in the automotive industry since Henry Ford. We are really seeing some innovation that requires not just tip of the spear type innovation in security, but also outside of the box thinking with regards to just IT infrastructure in general. If you think about all of the parts of a vehicle that require some sort of cybersecurity, it's way above and beyond what we traditionally used to think of as, a car might have a small computer in it as an engine control unit, and you have the entertainment center, with your radio and maybe a touch screen. If you look at what's happening today, vehicular autonomy, over-the-air updates, navigation, within vehicle autonomy, even systems have radar and LiDAR on board. You have to have computers to control those systems. And then even stuff outside of the automobile that we have to think about securing. An example would be a charging station. A charging station, if you think about it, it has to talk to the car. It has to talk to the electric company. They accept payment, so it's a credit card processing device. It has to understand what the weather is because charge rates are temperature dependent. And so, there's connectivity there to what's happening, with the external environment, sensors on board, all this kind of stuff. So the security ramifications of the innovation that are happening in the automotive industry is amazing. And by the way, we're not just talking about a website getting defaced or something like that. We're talking about if we don't do our jobs right, the accidents
Mhm.
could happen. People could be injured or killed. So it's an entirely different world than what it used to be in that industry. And there's an expectation, by the way, that the automakers are essentially driving a lot of this innovation, asking the questions of what's possible. They're expecting the IT and cybersecurity communities to step up and innovate as well and answer the questions. How do we do a better job than we have in the past with securing things? When we talk about the Internet of Things, this is the ultimate thing. We're talking about the
Mhm.
car that people get into and every day. So it's a fascinating time to be connected to the automotive industry in any way.
Yeah, and I think this actually directly ties into a conversation that Neil and I had recently had. I honestly can't remember which guest it was around, but Neil had basically referenced that they brought in, I think, a Tesla to DEF CON and just let people go at it and just see what they could do to kind of breach in. And his response was, I guess, I'll call it a device because it's more than a car at that point. They completely bricked it, totally unusable. They'll have to flash and put the software back on from like factory reset kind of situation. And I guess for the event that he is coming up for Texas Cyber event, he's going to rent a Tesla and do a similar exercise. So good luck to Neil on that. I don't know if
Have
I
him,
would put
yeah, have him get the insurance policy, will you, on the rental?
right. Yeah, I don't even know if insurance policies would cover software destruction to that extent, but yeah, I think that's pretty interesting. Obviously, with that in mind, they're going to have to, do more pen testing, start adhering to a lot of these other compliance and regulation elements. So they're also, taking in a lot more risks. So I'm sure they're obviously starting to be a lot more proactive. They have to treat it like a hardware Internet of Things, software manufacturer. There's just so much more that these companies are taking on. So, even with a push for moving to like electric devices in the next 2 years, 5 years, that's a lot to take on for a company.
It's very interesting. The automotive industry has come a long way, and not just the auto industry, but a lot of industries have come a long way in embracing the cybersecurity community when it comes to managing vulnerabilities and threats to their devices. I remember Andy Greenberg wrote a fantastic article in Wired magazine years ago about Charlie Miller and Chris Vilsack hacking into a Jeep using the over-the-air 4G connectivity, and
Mm,
and back in those days when they did that, it was a proof of concept for them. But the whole world was generally very much kind of arms folded when cybersecurity practitioners would say, "Hey, I think I found something." It was very much you had to kind of really push on manufacturers, not just of automobiles, but of electronic devices, wireless access points, everything, to get them to pay attention to vulnerabilities. Today, if you look at how industry, be it financial services or automotive or retail, looks at the problem, they welcome the good folks, the cybersecurity practitioners,
mhm.
to attempt to compromise these systems so they can fix them. Better us than the bad guys because we don't have a propensity for stealing money or killing people, right? And so they're very interested in having the cybersecurity community contribute to the discovery of vulnerabilities and the mitigation of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure you're familiar with Auto ISAC and some of the other ISACs out
Of
there who
course,
are helping to create that collective defense. So fortunately, there are organizations that are helping connect people, even if the brands are technically competitors when it comes to cybersecurity. That's kind of out the window. Any threat intelligence that
that's right.
one can share to the others. Yeah,
That's right. The
very
bad guys
cool.
are the real competition in cyberspace.
Yeah, without a doubt. There's no reason to ever, sling that kind of competition when it comes to protecting one another. So
That's right.
I love
That's
that
right.
aspect of our space. There's just no necessary competition in that regards. So that being said, I'd love to kind of redirect us back towards some of our basic AZT related activity. So I have a pretty good assumption that most people that listen to our podcast are very well acquainted what managed security services providers do. But in the event that they don't, maybe you can just give like an elevator pitch on where you come in and how you support organizations.
Sure. If you think about what an organization needs to do from a security perspective, the world of the possible is, let's call it 200 things you could do in security, right? Everything from authentication to vulnerability management to policies and governance and identity and disaster recovery, all of those things. And very few organizations have the capability to do all of those things. And so, the natural question is, okay, where do I need to go to get some of that capability? And then also, there's the 24/7 nature of security now. The days of the security and IT teams walking out the door on Friday, turning the lights off and coming back on Monday to see what happened are over. So the expectation is that organizations have, 24/7, 365 security capability. That's where managed security services firms like Nuspire come into play, where, we take care of things like endpoint detection and response, managed detection response, monitoring SIM for the environment, in a 24/7, 365, always on kind of capacity. Um, Managed vulnerability services, helping clients with the scanning and identification of vulnerabilities in their environment. Things like managing critical infrastructure like firewalls and wireless devices, things of this nature. So a managed security services provider really is designed to be the security team for an organization that either doesn't have one, doesn't have one that operates 24/7, 365, or has one but has additional capabilities that they need that they've got to go outside and ask someone else to do for them. Most commonly, you'll see managed security services firms handling some of the really complex technology that an organization might not want to build the internal capability around. SIM is a great example. The monitoring technologies, creating rules, event correlation, matching those with threats, and then of course the threat intelligence piece that goes along with that is something that most organizations have to really make an informed decision on. Am I going to build that capability internally, or is that something that I'm going to, ask someone else to do? And that's where we really come to bear.
Yeah, and I don't want to give a sales pitch in your direction by any
Sure.
means, but
Yeah.
so a life or what feels like a lifetime ago, I essentially worked for an MSP. We focused on social engineering. So, every organization brand, the bigger you get, the more phishing lures they get and all that. Just the sheer amount of volume that you get for the internal SOC would be impossible for most organizations to handle. So, I totally get the need and the auxiliary support for an organization like that. And then mid-market organizations in particular, do they have thousands and thousands of dollars to support next gen XDRs or SIM or SIEM, however you want to pronounce it? The technology that you all probably have and you all have staff to specifically support, it's not really easy or cost effective necessarily for most organizations.
Yeah, Elliot, kind of what you're speaking to here also relates to the talent shortage. Organizations have to fight really hard to attract and retain the talent to manage, systems that are very complex and stay on top of the cybersecurity landscape. And that's a whole lot more of an expensive proposition than it once was. And so that's another element where an MSP or an MSSP, this is true in IT as well, have become much more important to an organization in, bringing modern current capability to bear for an organization. It's hard to hire people, especially if they're the only person who's going to do that role in a company. That's not a particularly often attractive thing for a cybersecurity practitioner to go do. So
Mhm.
the talent shortage plays a role in all of this as well.
I want to say some of our biggest clients back in the day, they had so many phishing lures that a security practitioner would just, their mind would melt. Most of them were obviously benign. They're reported by internal
Right.
staff, but the folks that have the experience, they want to threat hunt, they want to pen test and be able to do all the things that actually help keep companies secure in a proactive state versus more of a reactive and constantly looking at really bad spam with spelling errors and stuff like that. So yeah, more power to y'all for basically able to take the brunt of it. And I think that transitions to the core of what we're out here to talk about, which is adopting zero trust. So obviously, it's not necessarily a new term, and in past episodes, how we've essentially come is every single episode there's like a new keyword that we focus on around. So there's the culture of it and how it impacts the organization, or zero trust as a philosophy. But I think even from the support side, you all are the champions, the coaches. Even if zero trust is bullshit, which I'm not saying it is, we're not here to pass that. We're just here to have those conversations. I can't imagine how many organizations come to you and say, I want zero trust solution. We know that it's not
Right,
technology in itself, but what does that
right.
look like, from day one when a company says the magic keyword zero trust, what does that conversation look like?
Elliot, it's one of those terms that's extremely ambiguous. It's like when a customer comes to us and says, help me with cloud security or help me with data protection. And so, really, the first thing that we have to do is unpack what problem is it they're trying to solve. And that helps us get to the heart of what is a solution, what are the technologies and processes that they need to adopt in order to solve that particular problem. To some organizations, they're trying to solve a problem of maybe secure remote work. We saw that a lot during COVID, where organizations had built this massive infrastructure to protect their employees on prem, and then they sent everybody home and were asking, okay, how do we protect these folks? And the obvious answer was, hey, let's adopt zero trust. And so often folks would come to us with the term, and the idea would be, okay, what is it we're actually trying to solve for, and then unpacking that. What we find is that different organizations, even within the same industry, tend to have different views on what zero trust means. It kind of depends upon what the security and IT teams have been reading and absorbing in the past. And so we really have to get to that question. What problem is it they're trying to solve? And what we often see is they don't actually have aspirations of the mythical state of zero trust. They actually are trying
Mhm.
to just move their demarcation of trust around. And by that, what I mean is, if you think to use the moat and castle analogy, when we lived in a world of everything was on-prem, you had the moat around the castle, you had perimeter firewalls, you had really robust perimeter security, VPNs, you had all this infrastructure that was designed to essentially demark trust at the network layer and say, if you're not on my network, I don't trust you, you're bad. Well, the moat essentially dried up, and we have, the whole castle thing doesn't work for, the application world. It doesn't work for cloud. It doesn't work for curbside pickup. It doesn't work for, modern business. And so essentially what we've done is we've moved the demarcation line, the moat of trust, away
Mhm.
from the network and kind of up the stack, if you will, to where now we need to start thinking about which applications do we trust or not trust, which platforms do we trust or not trust, which identities do we trust or not trust, what does the people side of the equation need to look like. And that's really the journey to zero trust, is that movement of the moat, if you will, to make it as small of a moat as possible, but still protect the castle, keep the business safe. So we spend a lot of time with our clients trying to unpack what is it you're really trying to do when you're thinking about zero trust.
Yeah, I love that. That is the sole purpose really of this podcast, is to have these conversations, because uh, I have a marketing background. I fully admit to the pain that can be put out into the world. Fortunately, an organization that I spend most of my time with, we make sure that it's not using buzzwords like that. So
Right.
it's so prevalent that when they pitch CISOs and executives and security folks in the buyer committee, I think they're unnecessarily creating a lot of confusion. And I think it's okay to kind of maybe hook them a little bit with some shiny object and say, yeah, we're going to help you do this. But
Right.
there is no such thing as a zero trust solution. And I love that you're able to capture that and help kind of coach them through that. And I think that's one of the most critical areas that organizations like you all support, is being really like a trusted partner. And, there's just not a lot of that in the security space, especially this security technology space where it's very transactional in nature.
Oh, you're so right, Elliot. This particular area is one where the product companies really haven't been particularly helpful here, because so many of the product companies have said, we're the zero trust company. And you have to really unpack that as an MSSP or a consulting organization. You really have to help a customer that's trying to solve a very specific problem or a group of problems. Unpack some of that and ask the question: okay, does this product really work for you or not? I know the vendor said it does because they say they're the zero trust company, and that's everywhere. Not picking on a particular product at all. It's just pervasive in the industry. It's a new trend emerges. It kind of reminds me back of 2008, 2009, 2010. Secure mobility was all the rage, and everyone was a secure mobility company. The question was, well, what does that mean? What does secure mobility actually entail? And so, yeah, you're right. There's a lot of noise in the industry with this particular topic, and others like cloud security.
I know for our repeat listeners, you probably hear me say, Neil and myself say that absolutely every time, but I think that's justifiable because that's what you'll see when you Google search zero trust. You're going to be like, oh, technology, technology, technology. Instead,
right.
And this is my next question to you is, if you are interested in actually trying to understand what zero trust is, do you have a particular resource that you point people towards? Obviously, we've got like NIST and CISA and a few other things, but those are very dry and hard to understand. So where does your organization sort of grasp what that is and help disseminate, what the true problems are related to it?
Yeah, it's a great question, Elliot. And I think it all begins with, what does the business do, and what are the threats that are relevant to that business, and what are the capabilities that we have to deal with those threats? Really a simple risk equation, right? Who are the bad guys? Why are they trying to, or how are they trying to get at us? And what do we have in place to stop that from happening? And then you kind of start to back into some of the other terms like zero trust. It becomes a function of, what is it I need to do? The frameworks are great. Some of them that you mentioned, we have a lot of customers who run their entire security programs off of like the SIS 18, or maybe they have a regulatory requirement like PCI, and they put a lot of work into the PCI part of the equation. So that those are areas where we certainly leverage those control frameworks. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to how does this business operate? And by the way, you'd be surprised at how many security people aren't really in tune with some of the fundamentals of what is really important from a cyber perspective about a business. And to use the manufacturing example, because we talked about it earlier, in the cybersecurity profession, we tend to be wired around protecting confidentiality. We talk a lot about encryption. We talk a lot about authentication and authorization. A lot of ink gets spilled in our industry around that. But in the manufacturing space, really availability is far more important for most manufacturers than confidentiality. If your conveyor belt isn't running, or your widget maker isn't stamping out widgets, your business is in real trouble. And so, we often have to help cybersecurity practitioners unpack what's important to the business from a cyber perspective. Then we unpack the threat space and start to look at, okay, how, not just who are the bad guys, but how are they attempting to hurt that thing that we just identified is really important to you. And in the case of to extend the manufacturing example, we have to think about things like ransomware. We have to think about things like industrial control systems and IoT security that are extremely relevant to that particular business. Then we start to get into, okay, what does it mean to be zero trust in this environment? What technology controls do we have to have in place, that make it really hard for this attack to be successful? Where does that fit in the regulatory and governance frameworks like NIST or ISO, or any of the regulations that an organization has to follow? And so that's really it's not so much a singular resource, if you will, to go look at, okay, this is what I need to do to get smart in this area. It's more about just unpacking the elephant a little bit and determining, okay, what are the little things that I need to understand in order to see the big picture of, how to protect this organization.
Interesting. Yeah, to me it kind of sounds like the basics of, just doing a risk assessment, even identifying where your biggest gaps are, prioritizing them, and then seeing if they're, I guess on paper, is a zero trust principle or concept that you can kind of wrap around that. Not necessarily just attacking it with a piece of technology, because obviously you need
Right.
processes and inventory everything first. But yeah, it honestly sounds like something as basic as a risk assessment and risk management program and prioritizing from there.
It's very common for us, and I'm sure, Elliot, you've heard this throughout the years as well. It's common for us to be approached with, hey, I have this technology I want to implement. And when you start to unpack a little bit about, okay, why do you want to implement that technology? What problem are you trying to solve? Usually, a singular piece of technology won't solve a complex problem. Sometimes it does, but very rarely. Usually solving a problem, and this is especially true in the world of the zero trust journey, is a little bit of governance and risk management and acceptance of certain things that maybe we can't do anything about. It's a little bit of process and standards in order to make sure that we're consistently doing the right thing. It's the technology, of course, and then it's the metrics side of it, making sure that we're measuring and understanding, is this technology that I deployed, along with those processes and the governance that I put in place, are they doing the right things to protect the organization and keep me safe, from the threat that I was really concerned about. So yeah, you're right. And the script, essentially that risk assessment component of it, is a little bit of a flip of the script. I'm an old school cybersecurity person. We started off with everything could be solved with technology. If it has a light that blinks, it'll fix the problem. Don't worry about it. I've got antivirus. I've got firewalls. We're good. And wow, has the world changed? That is just not the case anymore.
And I think that's the other aspect of this. And I know we're sort of preaching to the choir because our general audience are security folks who live and breathe this every day. But I guess we do also have the vendors that like to fall into our inbox and say, "Hey, we'll give you money for shout outs and stuff like that." But
Right,
for
right.
the rest of those folks that are listening, I think that's a critical aspect for like how they bring these conversations to organizations. So for larger organizations, they already understand that they have profound and mature risk management programs. They grasp that. For those mid-market organizations who are getting approached by technology vendors and sort of being coached towards their product, I think it's always important to just reiterate the need for processes and making sure you have the people to support that technology, and if it can actually support it.
We tell our customers all the time, you should define the problem that you're trying to solve and then expect us to answer how we'll solve for it, as opposed to us defining the problem for you and then obviously presenting a solution that perfectly fits the problem. Imagine that, right? So
Right.
it definitely it definitely works best when an organization has some sort of an idea. And by the way, sometimes the answer is I don't know. That's okay. We can help any good cybersecurity consulting organization. Can help an organization answer that question. What problem am I really trying to solve here? But we always get a little nervous when the problem is defined by, it's the whole "don't ask the barber if you need a haircut," kind of a thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great example, especially that's why I like to wear my hat,
Yeah,
so
right.
I don't have to deal with that conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I don't
Uh,
have to have that conversation with the barber. I'm good.
yeah, I'm heading in that direction too. I feel that. So I know a few weeks ago that you all had put out, I don't know if it's quarterly that you do it, but you put out like your threat reports. I'm curious,
Right.
and I know this is totally a redirection of conversation. So, but curious, what elements have y'all seen as an increase in threats, especially with obviously the past few years moving to remote? Has there been any impact on that? And obviously, we can kind of tie that back to zero trust as well.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to have the vantage point. This is actually one of my favorite parts about working with an MSSP.
Hmm.
The vantage point of seeing how the bad guys are operating across a wide variety of industries, and who those threat actors are. It's very interesting. Well, we tend to think of the hacker space as the kid in the basement, that you slide a pizza to every once a week, and that kind of thing, right? And that's not it at all, right? These are very sophisticated nation state actors, criminal organizations, that are extremely well funded, often by their own governments or at arm's length funded by their own governments. And they usually have very specific motivations and desires. We kind of know, that the Russians and the Eastern Europeans are really after, money and the financial services organizations, and the Chinese are after intellectual property and, secrets and defense information, things like
Hmm.
that. And where it gets interesting is when organizations, and there are a great number of them, meet the crux of the interest of all of those different bad guys. It's not uncommon for a supplier to have a connection to the aerospace industry and a connection to the retail industry and a connection to the financial services industry. We see that a lot with, in manufacturers that make electronics or any kind of widget that would be interesting to those various industries. And so, the threat actors do tend to, be very motivated by a common purpose, if you will.
Hmm.
Some of the examples I just threw out there. So it's interesting to watch how they all operate. And by the way, they might be operating together and not realize it to put a company at risk, right? And so we see a lot of that. The other thing that we see is, and this kind of pops up in the threat report, there certainly is an emergence of the bad guys using older vulnerabilities. It used to be the bad guys were all focused on zero-day vulnerabilities and the brand new stuff that there weren't defenses around yet. And I think, the bad guys, especially that second tier of bad guys, maybe the ones who aren't funded by a government, but are a sophisticated criminal enterprise that has, tools and the resources to pull off an attack. They've realized that it's a lot cheaper to, instead of developing your own zero-day vulnerability or zero-day attack, to go after some of the more well-known vulnerabilities that are likely to have not been patched. And so, there certainly is that. I'll say this: in looking at the threat landscape and looking at TTPs, the techniques, tactics,
Hmm.
procedures that the bad guys use, it's really interesting how many of those go all the way back to basics, fundamentals,
Hmm.
vulnerability and patch management, multi-factor authentication, strong passwords, the stuff that is not particularly glamorous. And by the way, when it comes to, adopting zero trust, often the stuff that's just assumed, that isn't really considered, how critical that stuff is to keeping the bad guys from being successful.
The way that we keep talking about adopting zero trust in general, it's more of a repackaging of everything that has been building up to this point. So 10 years ago, I think it was a little more abstract. Today, obviously, it's very fractured. But the way that, again, I lived in that world as well. So I had some visibility and had fun analyzing data. But, a lot of what we saw were threat actors taking advantage of low hanging fruit, not
Right.
people not patching things, people reusing passwords, the account gets popped, and they get hit again. Elements like that. So it doesn't even need zero trust, which is removing implicit trust. It's like the most basic core elements, even beyond multi-factor. Will that help secure them? Absolutely, but not reusing a password. That's like not even
Right.
101. I don't know how to explain that. So
Right.
yeah,
Right.
I totally get that.
We see this conversation often with encryption, where organizations want to adopt, better and better encryption. And when we start asking about their authentication scheme, they're using passwords, they're not using MFA, they don't have privileged access management. They have privileged users that have the same account as their daily driver account. And, we have to kind of, pull the cable and stop the train a little bit and say, hey, you can't have good encryption without great authentication. It's not possible. And the same is true in anything regarding zero trust. We can't move that demarcation of trust around if we haven't shored up the fundamentals. Uh, Endpoint detection and response is another great example of, I can't really move very far down that zero trust journey if I'm not doing the right things on the endpoint.
Mhm.
And so there's a lot of that part of the conversation that happens too. And again, a lot of this is just back to fundamentals and doing the basic right things for hygiene that enables the freedom to go do some of the other more out there things and more freedom and liberty in digital, if you will,
Hmm.
comes from having some of those fundamentals shored up.
I totally agree with that. And I think the other element is, beyond the basics and obviously implementing multi-factor. Uh, I, it's probably not this year. I feel like I've seen the hype die down. There's been a few less headlines around ransomware attacks. I think it's more like just straight up breaches, which probably comes through phishing and other social engineering. But I'm curious, in your mind, have you seen, and it doesn't have to be a technological element, but have you seen a zero trust related solution towards ransomware, which again, I realize is hopefully the hype is down and hopefully threat actors are, you know, navigating towards other techniques. But I'm just kind of curious based on that, because I know that's still always a flagged item, especially in like the report you all put out.
Yeah, for sure. Ransomware and DDoS continue to be the number one and number two things that our clients ask us about as far as concerns
Hmm.
that they have for their business. So, that's not going away anytime soon. I think the trend with regards to ransomware, which is very appropriate in a zero trust conversation, is the idea of stopping ransomware as early in the kill chain as possible.
Hmm.
When ransomware first really became a thing, we were really focused on detection and response. And I think part of that, if you think about it, was a pendulum swing, because a decade or so ago, maybe even a little bit longer than that, we focused all our energy on prevention, right? We had antivirus that had lists of known viruses floating around on the computer. And every once in a
Hmm.
while, a new vulnerability would emerge, a new threat would emerge that the antivirus didn't have in the list, and something bad would happen. And we'd say, hey, the prevention failed, and we've got to focus on detection and response. And so the industry pendulum swung toward detection, quick response. And I think what's happening now is the pendulum is starting to swing back the other way, and that if I can stop that ransomware very early on in the kill chain, either at the delivery of the phishing link or the attempted detonation of the payload, or stopping the lateral movement, the earlier I can stop that threat from occurring in the life cycle of the threat, the cheaper it is to mitigate, the less likelihood of there being serious damage, and the more effective I'm likely to be at containing something that could threaten the entire enterprise. And that's that really goes hand in hand with this idea of zero trust, in that I'm not going to let the creepy crawly get in and infect my whole network before I try and stop it or do anything about it. I'm going to try and zap it as early as I can in its life cycle. So that's certainly a trend that we see. I have to give kudos to a lot of the EDR companies who have really embraced the idea of, we've got to look for not just things that we know about, but we've got to look for anomalous behavior or things that are happening on a machine that give us pause, or changes in executables and things that are running on the device, and go, hey, something's not right here. And maybe it's okay to err sometimes on the side of, I'm going to stop this thing from happening, and maybe I'm going to disrupt the operation of that device, as opposed to the old school way of thinking was, we don't want to get in the way of anybody doing their job, we don't want to interrupt anybody's email or web surfing, and then bad stuff happens, right? So
Hmm.
that's been a positive change in our industry, I think.
Very interesting. And I know, considering that you have a vast collection of customers and clients, you all probably have greater visibility into any of that kind of anomalous situation that might flag, because as a single entity, a single brand, or even with subsidiaries, you have a narrow view. You see what you see, unless you have a threat intelligence platform. Even with feeds, you just don't get that kind of accessibility and viewpoint.
Right.
So obviously removing implicit trust and lateral movement, that makes sense to me. I'm curious, like, do you all use, I guess, information internally against client to help prevent that and kind of gain visibility into that footprint?
Oh, it's an expectation of our business and our industry that we'll do
Hmm.
that. For instance, if we see an attack emerging in the healthcare space, and we figure out, okay, here's a way to thwart that attack, we need to immediately propagate that to our other healthcare customers and say, hey, we just saw something, and there was an attempt against client, patient zero, if you will, right? And
Hmm.
here's the mitigation to that. So absolutely, and that's one of the benefits of of being an MSSP is that we're able to peer across industries, and then within each industry peer across customers and answer some questions around, what is this threat actually trying to do, and is it something that we need to be worried about for a particular type of customer. A great example of this would be in the healthcare space. Attacks against providers and attacks against payers tend to be wildly different types of attacks. Both of those organizations are regulated by HIPAA, so they have the same fundamental compliance requirements. They're putting the same checks in the boxes for their security programs. But providers are really worried about medical devices and ransomware shutting down parts of their operation. Whereas on the payer side of the equation, they're more like a financial services, entity. And so that's an example of, as an MSSP, we might have the vantage point of being able to see, okay, even peering within a particular industry, what sub verticals in that industry are the bad guys really going after? And it's a critical part of what an organization should expect out of an MSSP, is the ability to do that.
Awesome. All right. So it looks like Neil slipped in here.
Would it be a little too preemptive to talk about just the general transition of the impact of MSSPs versus at homegrown spun security relative to getting things done? Maybe that's still a little too sensitive.
Neil, it's a really hot topic. Matter of fact, we just did a study and we did a webinar on the study, and we're actually continuing to do some work around the study on what parts of a security program is an organization most likely to outsource, what problems are folks trying to solve. And what we're finding is really multifold. One, organizations have, we obviously know about the talent shortage and all of the issues that come with that. So organizations are viewing their security practitioners that they have internally as a much more precious entity than they once did. So on one hand, they're looking to outsource a lot of the commoditized stuff that's more, if you think about it, kind of the grunt work of security: vulnerability scanning and patch management, endpoint detection and response, managing the EDR platform, managing SIM and the whole detection and response side of the equation. And then on the other hand of the equation, we have all this new stuff coming out that organizations aren't equipped to deal with. Cloud configuration management, cloud security posture monitoring, managing a remote workforce in a unique way, business transformation where apps are going more mobile and digital than they have before, and so there are application security requirements an organization might not be comfortable with. So what we see is both ends of the spectrum being prime candidates for outsourcing: the commoditized stuff, that's the grunt work, the stuff you have to do, and then the really far out there stuff that it's really hard to grow internal talent for and find folks that can do that for you. Where we see organizations recognizing they need to continue to have internal capability, number one, around security governance and knowing the business. No MSSP is going to understand your business the way that you do. And so having the governance and the risk side of the equation internal is a great thing, as well as a lot of the security architecture and that connectivity between security and IT is really important to not outsource. IT is trying to move the business in a fast way. Business is moving faster than it ever has. And so, having a security function internally that's really connected with the business and also connect as that liaison to a third party like an MSSP to say, hey, here's a new problem that's emerging for me. Here's what I'm looking to solve for. Can you help me? That's capability that an organization almost always wants to have internally in order to be successful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's kind of a fun thing to think about. I personally see a couple of different aspects, like what you mentioned, new tech. Sometimes it's nice just to bring in that consultative or even that contractor status to help with the new tech. Second, you mentioned like the labor issues and stuff like that. I have my own personal opinions on how to go down that rabbit hole, whether it exists or not. But regardless, that it does exist for some reason or another, right? So supplemental staff. So what I've seen in the past, I've seen a lot of people take and just do basic supplemental post office hours stuff, right? So they're not a full 24/7 service provider,
right,
but they get them the after hours piece. So that way, the mundane things are still getting taken care of, or they leverage them exclusively for like a tier 1 response effort, right? And then let the team focus on those tier 2, 3, more research in depth type things. And then the last third part of that, like you mentioned, the tech piece as a whole, where you want to make sure that the core competency of what goes on in your tech stack is still you and not necessarily that contracted
Right.
labor force, right? So I think in the format of zero trust, we've talked about this on previous discussions. There's a whole new world out there of technology that's zero trust, right? There's a lot of people wanting to sell you something that is or isn't, that's repackaged, may not be repackaged, may be net new, may not be net new, but the concept is there. And so I think I have yet personally to see a service provider, MSSP type, promote zero trust in this sense. Right? I imagine they're there. I don't know if y'all have seen one, but have you seen that from a service approach to say, hey, look at us, we're zero trust. We're not just going to come and help you build it, but we are a MSSP that focuses on monitoring zero trust stack as a whole kind of thing.
Yeah, Elliot and I kind of talked about this earlier, where really it's about unpacking the problem for the customer. What problem is it you're trying to solve? And often they'll come to us and say, I need help with zero trust. And we don't necessarily know where they got that term from. Did it come from a technology provider who's trying to say, we're the zero trust company? Or, did it come from, some sort of reading somewhere about the concept in general? So we really start with what problem is it we're trying to solve, and how do we go with you on the journey towards zero trust? What do things look like for you today? What are your capabilities? And how does a business operate? What are the threats that are relevant? And so, I think we tend to try to not define the problem for our customers and say we're the zero trust managed security services provider. What we do is work with the client to understand, okay, what are the acute problems you're trying to solve for your business, and then what technologies and processes and governance and operations capability do we need to deploy in order to make sure that we get you there to solve that problem. And by the way, when you get to the end state, kind of looks like zero trust, right? It's just the natural evolution of all this. So we tend to back into zero trust with our clients more than kind of starting with zero trust as a conversation up front and working backwards from there. And you're right, Neil. Very few service providers want to get out there and talk about zero trust as a pure concept. And I think in part, Elliot and I talked about this a little bit earlier. In part, that's driven by the product companies over the course of the last half a decade have really kind of tried to define what zero trust means. And so what we find is we have to undo a lot of that, right? We've got to unpack there's no single box you can plug in that makes you a zero trust organization. And so, I think that's why a lot of us have been really shy about, going to the market with the term as service providers.
Yeah. I think that's kind of a wonderful thematic that we've gotten out of this so far, is everybody we've had on agrees that zero trust is not just a plug and play, every one-stop shop from anyone. Now, we haven't really talked to any of the legit vendor providers, right? The technology stack, right? We've talked to people who actually are doing something here.
Right.
So when we get there, it'd be fun to see from a vendor's perspective that promotes zero trust as their tool stack, what they consider it to be. But that being said, it's nice to see thematically the consistency of everyone who's actually doing it says, no, you're not going to get it from just me. You're not going to get it from just them. You may already have some of it, may already not have some of it. This is a multi-tier effort, a multi-technology effort. And we just got to find the right ways to make all these other things come together. So that's good to see, once again, thematically, that it's still there. So thinking on this a little bit more, the one thing that I think that you mentioned that is a little slightly different than some of the other approaches, you talk about backing them into the zero trust piece, which I think is a great approach. I think, if we think of zero trust as a security goal mark, or, where we want to be, instead of just leveraging it as a term to promote engagement.
Right.
I think it's a good approach. There's a lot of people who would come in and just say, hey, I've defined zero trust. Here's the standards of zero trust. And now we're going to go from that term down the stream. And I think you probably, there's pros and cons to either side of that. I think, if you start with the definition and you work your way backwards through that definition, yeah, you're probably still going to get to the same piece, but I think you're get a little more fixated on kind of that marketing fluff that goes with it. But in your perspective, you have your own grounded principles of what it means to do these security elements. that just happened to coincide with the concept of getting to zero trust. And I think maybe from your perspective, probably you go from that side towards the zero trust mentality with what works well. And then you can use the concept of zero trust to back in to make sure that you've checked the right bells and whistles, down the line. Probably. Is that sound kind of accurate from a deployment
That's
perspective?
absolutely right. It's a journey. It really is. It's like answering the question, when will I be secure? It really is a journey that we have to go, down the path together. And the fascinating thing, and one of the things I think that makes our profession such a unique and wonderful profession and vocation, is that it's ever changing. And so the journey is not linear. And the idea of getting there, it's a recipe for disappointment to say, I'll be really happy with my work performance when I get there, right? When the company's secure, I'm going to feel great about the job that I did. It is a journey, and zero trust is a journey. Even there are a lot of ambiguous concepts like cloud security, or what about security training and awareness? These are all journeys. They're you determine where you're at a particular point in time. You try and get better over time and more effective over time. And by the way, behind you in the journey, the bad guys are chasing you, right? So, you have an incentive to keep going, right? It's not a meandering, slow walk in our profession. It's definitely a high-speed journey, but a journey nonetheless.
Yeah, we're never done, are we? No
Right.
matter what we do, we're going to get through zero trust, and in 5 more years, there's going to be something, I don't know,
Right.
biometric only trust, or I don't know. I'm trying to think of what the next
Right.
trend is going to be as a whole, but yeah, always a constant battle, no matter what, for sure. So, Jared, once again, appreciate you coming on board. So, one final question that we like to ask in general, if you had to point to someone to 1 or 2 key resources to get started, what would you like to throw out to people to kind of poke and prod for the whole zero trust journey?
Yeah, here's kind of an odd one, but I would say as a security practitioner, start with the leaders of your business, and understand what is the single most important thing to that business that you as a cybersecurity practitioner need to protect. And it's amazing to me how many cyber practitioners have never really walked into a product owner, or a VP level or a C level individual, and said, "I'm here from security. Would you just spend 5 minutes with me and talk about what it is that I need to protect in this business?" And I think that opens itself up to so many subsequent learnings and conversations around, where in the journey towards zero trust do I go? Where do I start? What things do I need to be thinking about? And so I think that the number one resource is often that office down in the corner that we tend to stay away from, and it can be a wealth of information that guides some of the things that we go into further. And then of course there are all the learnings about, okay, how do I get smart on a particular attack and whatnot? And there are innumerable resources out there for that, but it all kind of begins and ends with, as a practitioner, what is it I'm trying to protect? I think that's really the first place to start.
Oh my God, I wish I would have been here sooner to have more fun. That I'm an Intel analyst, so you just hit that nose on the head for me. Start with business risk requirements in a roundabout way, figure out what those are, and go backwards from there. Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Well, JR, it's been absolutely a pleasure to chat with you, and love the insights that you were able to provide. I'll give a little bit of shout out. So if folks go over to JR's LinkedIn profile, you'll dig back a little bit and see that threat report that they put out. I don't know if y'all put it out quarterly, but I think it's pretty interesting as a resource. That said, again, thank you so much for joining us. We love chatting with folks like yourselves who have just an immense amount of visibility into our space.
Well, thank you both, and please keep up the great work. Fantastic podcast. We really appreciate you having it.
Thank you for joining AZT, an independent series. Your hosts have been Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis. To learn more about Zero Trust, go to adoptingzerotrust.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Slack community. Viewpoints expressed during the show do not reflect the brands, employers, or companies of our hosts, guests, or potential sponsors.